Please read along with me as I read Chapter 5. Chapter 5, New Lives. When they left Ellis Island, immigrants fanned out across America to start new lives. Their huge numbers transformed the face of the nation. In 1820, the U.S. population was about 10 million. By 1920, it was 10 times greater, largely due to the yearly inflow of people from Europe. Millions of immigrants moved to the vast plains out west. In the late 1800s, the government gave away land to homesteaders who agreed to farm it. When the free land ran out, railroad companies sold millions more acres at very low prices. They wanted towns to be built along their rail lines, and immigrants were eager to build them. Most immigrants, however, headed for the big cities to work in factories and mills. At the turn of the century, America's economy was booming. Across the nation, bridges, skyscrapers, and rail lines were being built. In 1913, new cars were pouring off assembly lines. The steel industry drove the boom, and immigrants supplied the manpower to make steel. More than half of U.S. steelworkers were immigrants. They worked 12-hour days, 7 days a week. Steel tycoon Andrew Carnegie gave his workers one day off on the 4th of July. On the other 364 days, his crews were on the job, working furnaces heated to about 3,000 degrees. Hard, I guess it's hard, said one immigrant steelworker. I lost 40 pounds the first 3 months I came into the business. It sweats the life out of a man. Fiorello LaGuardia, 1882 to 1947. LaGuardia's Italian father was Catholic and his immigrant mother from Austria-Hungary was Jewish. Able to speak 5 languages, LaGuardia worked as an interpreter at Ellis Island for 3 years while going to law school. He was known as one of the kindest officials on the island. After law school, LaGuardia spent much of his time pleading cases for immigrants. Then politics drew him away from law. In 1916, LaGuardia was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. In 1933, he became mayor of New York City. During his 12 years in office, LaGuardia oversaw the building of playgrounds, parks, and low-cost housing in poor neighborhoods. Today in New York, one of the nation's largest airports bears his name. Many immigrants leaving Ellis Island didn't go very far. 1 in 3 headed straight for New York City across the harbor. New York's towering skyscrapers, noisy streets, and endless activity were a world away from their quiet villages. The city dazzled us, said one new immigrant. A German boy, William Reinhardt, recalled the awe of his very first ride on an elevated train. All of a sudden, my family of 10 were in the sky. Here we had been 21 days on the water, and now we were sailing through the sky with water underneath us. Immigrants settled on blocks filled with people from their own homelands. Such neighborhoods were among the most crowded places in the world. On the Lower East Side, where millions settled over the years, more than 4,000 people lived on one block. Their housing was in 5 or 6 story buildings called tenements. Before, these buildings had held single families. Now up to 32 immigrant families squeezed into one. Sometimes 10 people slept in a single room. Since there was little air or sunlight inside, people spilled out onto the streets. Pushcarts and stands lined the sidewalks, selling familiar foods. Immigrants chatted with neighbors in their native language. They had brought some of the Old World to America. There were U.S. citizens who resented this. They expected the immigrants, who had walked through the nation's open doors, to give up their old ways, speak English, and become full-fledged Americans. This viewpoint, where cultures blended together into one whole, was called the melting pot. Child labor. Across the nation, child labor was common as immigrant youth tried to help their families survive. In 1900, nearly 2 million children between the ages of 5 and 14 worked full-time jobs, usually under terrible conditions. Lewis Hine, one of the photographers at Ellis Island, traveled across America for 10 years taking pictures of children in factories and mines. After seeing his photos, Congress began passing laws against child labor in 1916. Immigrants were often faced a great deal of prejudice. Finding a job was especially difficult. In New York, thousands of immigrants worked for very low pay in small factories called sweatshops. Families also turned their apartments into home sweatshops where parents and children worked together day and night. One boy recalled his Scottish family bent over the kitchen table to glue tiny pieces of jewelry. We'd work until midnight, but never after 1. At least I wouldn't, for I had to go to school in the morning. Over time, the lives of most immigrants improved, especially the children's. Italian immigrant Albertina de Gracia recalled, "We were dirt poor. This country gave us a chance, and we worked hard for our children, and now they've got what we worked for. We're satisfied." Often adult immigrants never learned English or changed their old ways, but their children did, in public schools. In many countries in Europe, only the rich could afford school. In the United States, school was free and open for every child. Mary Anton, a Russian immigrant, recalled being taken to school after her family moved to a Boston slum. A little girl from across the alley came and offered to take us to school. There were no applications made, no questions asked, no examinations, no fees. The doors stood open for every one of us. Andrew Carnegie, 1835 to 1919. Andrew Carnegie was a true rags to riches story. Born in Scotland, he came to the United States with his family in 1848 and settled in Pennsylvania. Extreme poverty forced him to begin working full-time in a cotton factory at age 13. Yet in time, he made a fortune in the steel industry and became one of the richest men in the world. Although Carnegie drove his workers very hard, he was a charitable man in his later years. He believed that the wealthy had a duty to use their money for the common good. Opening free local libraries was one of his favorite causes.